Hi everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we are going to discuss about the variable definitions file. Again, in production environment this is an important topic. Whenever you are describing a variable as part of the code, this specific file is also very important in designing the right structure. So with this base set, let's get started. Now, as we are discussing in a larger code base of Terraform, variable is one of the common things that you will see. Now, whenever you are describing the variables in such a larger amount, specifically in a production environment, maintaining them and keeping the overall code clean and reusable is a very important aspect. Now, in such case, when variables are so extensively used, HashiCorp recommends creating a separate file with the name of star.tfvars to define all the variables value in a project. Now note that it is variable value. It does not mean variable. So let's go ahead and understand this. Now, when you are working with Terraform in production environment, this is how your folder structure at a high level overview should look like. First one is that you should have a main configuration file. Second one is you should have the variables.tf file that defines all of the variables. And the third one is that you should have a tfvars file that defines value to all the variables. So this is how it looks like. First, you have the main configuration file. Second is you have the variables.tf file where you have defined all of the variables here. And third, you have the terraform.tfvars file where you have defined the value associated with the variables. So from here we can identify what this file allows us to do. So the difference between variables and terraform.tfvars is that in the variables file, you have just defined the variable. You have not added the value associated with the variable here. The value associated with the variable goes in the terraform.tfvars file. This is one thing that you have to keep a note of. Now let's look into how the terraform.tfvars file provides advantages specifically when you have multiple set of environments. For example, organization can have wide set of environments. It can be development, staging, prod, and many others. So in such cases, you will have your main configuration file here. In the main configuration file, you will have some set of variables, whatever variables that you have defined. Then you will have the tfvars file where you have the value associated with the variables that are defined. In this case, the name of tfvars file is dev.tfvars. So this is for dev environment. Similarly, you have one more file called as prod.tfvars. Again, you have some value associated with the variables here, and this is for the production environment. Now, one thing that you will see is that the value associated with a variable in the dev.tfvars and the prod.tfvars are different. For example, the VPN server IP is different across development and production environment. Along with that, the instance type is also different. In the development environment, you are using a smaller instance type. In a production environment, you are using a larger instance type. Now, generally, when you have multiple set of tfvars file available, whenever you're using Terraform plan, you can also specify which tfvars file you want to take into account. For example, here you have prod.tfvars file. So all the values associated with the production will be taken into account as part of the plan. Similarly, if you want to create an infrastructure in a development or a development environment like infrastructure, then you can specify dev.tfvars. So all the values associated with it will be taken into account. So in such case, when you have multiple tfvars, it becomes much more simpler because now you don't have to modify the variables.tf file. This variables.tf file, again, it will remain static, and based on the environment, the tfvars file will have the appropriate value. Great. So let's do one thing with this base set. Let's go ahead and look into how things work practically. Now for today's practical, I have a file called as variable-definition-file.tf. And it has a very simple code to create a EC2 instance. Again, this code is something that you'll get from our GitHub page to reference. Now, this specific file at this stage has a specific AMI. Again, there is a small comment which is this is for AP South 1 region. So in case if you are using any different region, make sure to replace this AMI. So generally in production environment, what you will do, you will create a file called as variables.tf. This is the first step. You create a variable, let's call it as AMI, and within here you add a default value, and the default value is something, let's just take it from here. I'll add it here, and within the AMI, I'll say var dot the name of the variable, it is AMI. Alright, this is very simple part to understand and we have already looked into it practically as well. Now, just for simplicity, you can also specify a description stating that this AMI is for Mumbai region. So now things become much more easier to understand, where if you try to run this in a different region, it will not work because this AMI ID is associated with Mumbai region only. Now, just for simplicity, whenever you try to create a EC2 instance, you will get a AMI ID. So this is what we are referring to. So this AMI ID ends with 3D4. If you go to any other region, for example, North Virginia, let's look into the AMI ID. You see you have a different AMI ID altogether. Alright, so this is one part that we need to keep a note of. Now this is what we have learned at this stage, where we create a variable and the value is part of the variable. So in today's video, we are going to add one more step on top of this, where we'll create one more file called as terraform.tfvars. Alright, so this .tfvars is very important, and within here, HashiCorp recommends that whatever value associated with a variable is, you add it in this file. For example, AMI, the value I'll add it here. Let me just copy it. I'll add it here. Alright, I'll save the change and let me also remove this. Alright, so you can have a code something similar to this, or if you don't want to add a description, the code will look something similar to this, where you have just defined the variable, nothing else. All the values associated with the variable is part of the terraform.tfvars file. So generally in production environment, this is the folder structure that you will be looking for, and this is the recommended one. So let's save the change. From the terminal, you can do a Terraform plan. Let's verify if we are able to see the output. Let's look into the AMI, whether the AMI ID is populated. As expected, here you see the AMI ID is successfully populated. So Terraform knows that if a value is not part of the variables file, it has to take from the tfvars file here. This is one part. Now, one more thing that I wanted to show you is that you can also have a default value over here. For example, I'll say default, and within the default value, let me just say AMI 1234. Alright, I'll save the change, and just for simplicity, I'll remove this and I'll save it. So a terraform.tfvars file is empty at this stage. So now if I clear the screen and if we do a Terraform plan, then in such case, Terraform will take whatever default value is present as part of the variable. Now let's also look into the second case, where you have the default value also present and you have the value also added in tfvars file. So now which value Terraform will take? Let's explore that. So again, we'll clear the screen. We'll do a Terraform plan. If we go a bit up, you see this time Terraform has taken the value from tfvars file. So the default value is only taken if Terraform does not find the value associated with a variable in any other place. If you have explicitly mentioned in the tfvars file, then Terraform will ignore this specific default value. This is one important part that you have to keep a note of. Now, one more thing, as we were discussing in our first slide, where we have discussed that HashiCorp recommends creating a separate file with the name of star.tfvars. So at this stage, it is not compulsory that you have to name it terraform.tfvars. However, it is recommended. Let's look into what happens if you do not name it terraform.tfvars. So let's remove this default value here. And this terraform.tfvars, let's just call it as prod.tfvars or any other name you can give. Let's save this. Let's clear the screen. Now, when you do a Terraform plan, you see we are not getting the plan output. It is asking us to enter the variable of AMI. And this is the reason why whenever you have a file with a different name apart from terraform.tfvars, you'll have to explicitly specify the name of the tfvars file. So this is what we were discussing here, where in the var file you specify the name of tfvars. I'll just do a Control C. For Terraform plan this time, I'll say var file followed by the name of the file, which is prod.tfvars. Now, if we try to run a Terraform plan, you see things are working. Now, this kind of a setup also proves to be useful when you have multiple set of tfvars file. For example, in this specific slide, we were discussing that we have a separate tfvars file for dev and prod environment with different values altogether. So now if you want to create a dev environment, you can refer to the dev.tfvars file as part of the Terraform plan command. If you want to create a prod environment, you can use the prod tfvars file. Alright, so this kind of a setup makes things much more simpler. So with this, I hope you understood what Terraform tfvars file allows us to do. This is also referred to as a variable definition file. Great. Now just for simplicity, I've also added this pointer as part of the last slide just to revise, where if a file name is terraform.tfvars, Terraform will automatically load the values from it. It makes things simpler. However, if you decide to have a different name of tfvars like prod.tfvars, then you'll have to explicitly set it as part of the plan operation. Great. So that's a very high level overview, and I hope with this you understood the basics of the variable definitions file in Terraform. Hi everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we are going to discuss about the approach to variable assignment in Terraform. Now one thing that you have to keep a note of is that by default, whenever you are defining a variable in your configuration file, you must also set a value associated with that variable. For example, you have a main configuration file. Within here, you have a variable of instance type that is being associated with the argument. Now, the next part is that you have to define that variable in the variables.tf file. Now, apart from both of this, the value associated with the variable should also be defined is what this specific pointer is referring to. Now, the question that comes is, what happens if variable is defined but there is no value associated with the variable? How will Terraform work in that case? Similar to this specific screenshot where you have just defined a variable of instance type, there is no value. In such case, let's look into how Terraform will behave. Now for today's practical, I have a file called as variable-assignment.tf, a very simple file which creates a EC2 instance. Now let's say that one of the arguments here is AMI. Let's make it a variable, or just for simplicity, let's say instance type will make it as a variable. I'll say var.instance_type. I'll save this. Apart from that, I'll create a file called as variables.tf, and within here I'll say variable of instance_type, and I'll just define it here. There is no value added to this specific variable. So in such case, when you do a Terraform plan, let's quickly do that. Let's look into how Terraform will behave in this case. Immediately, Terraform is requesting the input to this variable. So in the CLI itself, Terraform is asking what is the value associated with the variable that you want. So within here, let's say, I'll say t2.micro. So now Terraform will use that specific value in this plan operation. For example, here you see instance type, it is t2.micro. Similarly, if you do a Terraform apply, that value that we had added in the plan operation is lost. So in the apply also, you'll have to manually add the value associated with the variable that you want for this apply operation. Alright, so this is what the next slide is all about, where if you have not defined a value of a variable, Terraform in the CLI, it will ask you to define it. Now, at this stage, we have seen that there are multiple ways in which you can declare a value associated with a variable. You can add it as part of the default, you can add it as part of the terraform.tfvars file and so on. So these are the two approaches that we have seen. But there are many other places where you can define the variable value is what we are going to explore in today's video. Now at a high level overview, we were already discussing about the variable defaults. This is something that we have seen. Second one is the variable definition file, which is the tfvars file. Apart from that, you can also define the variable values as part of the environment variable. You can also set the variables as part of the command line. So let's explore each one of these approach. The first one is the variable default, where you see you add the default here along with the variable. So if there is no value associated with the variable that you add as part of the TFRs, the default value will be taken into account. The second one is the variable definitions file, which is the TFRs file, where you define the variable name and you define the value associated with the variable. We have already seen that if you have defined both the default value and the value in the TFRs file, the TFRs file will take the higher precedence here. The next option is you can also set the variable as part of the command line using the -var option. Now at this stage, we have seen that if you do not specify the value of the variable, the Terraform will ask you to define it as part of the prompt. But if you do not want that prompt, you can also directly decide to specify the -var, the variable name, the variable value. This will also work. Let's explore this. So let's quickly do a Control C. So if you do a Terraform plan, you can say -var, specify the variable name, which is instance type in our case, specify the variable value, let's say m5.large, and press enter. So now Terraform will not ask you for the prompt. If you see instance type, Terraform has automatically taken the m5.large. Alright, so I hope you understood this approach as well. Now the last approach that we also have to be familiar with is you can set the variable value using the environment variables. Now whenever you are using the environment variable to set the value of a variable, the environment variable must be of a specific naming convention. For example, instance type is the variable name. Now, if you want a value of the instance type to be taken from environment variable, then the environment variable should have this naming convention of tf_var underscore the name of variable, whatever it may be. Then only Terraform will take it as part of the environment variables. Let's also explore this. So let's do one thing. Let's clear the screen. At this stage, if you just do a Terraform plan, it will ask you for the prompt to specify the instance type. Now we have already explored multiple ways in which this value can be taken from. The last approach that we want to discuss is the environment variable, which is also occasionally used in a large set of use cases. Now, as we are discussing that if you want to use environment variable to store the value associated with the variable, the environment variable needs to have a specific naming convention, which is tf_var underscore the variable name. So in this case, the variable value that is not defined is the instance type. So it should be specified something similar to this. Now for today's video, what I am going to do, I am going to show you on how you can create the environment variable in Windows. So if you are using Mac or if you are using Linux, the overall approach is a little different, which we are going to explore in the next video. Alright, so today only Windows approach we are exploring as part of this video. So let's do one thing. I'll just open the run utility. Within here, I'll just add a command called as sysdm.cpl. Now within here, this is a system properties. Now within here, you can go to advanced. In the environment variable, you can add a new variable. I'll say tf_var underscore instance underscore type, and the variable value would be say t2.large. I'll do a OK. I'll do a OK. Alright. So now from the command line, if we'll do a Terraform plan, again you see it is asking for the instance type. Now generally if you're working with environment variable, one thing that you need to note is that if you have the command prompt open similar to how it is right now, and then you add an environment variable, so in such case the existing command prompt will not be able to fetch the variable. You have to close the command prompt and you have to open a new command prompt after the variable is created, then only the value will be fetched. So I'll close this, and from our KP Labs Terraform folder, I'll open up the terminal again. This time, if you do a Terraform plan, you see things are working. And if you look into the instance type, it is t2.large. Great. So I hope with this you understood multiple different approaches that you can use to assign a value to a variable in Terraform. And with this, we'll conclude today's video. Hi everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video, we are going to look into how we can set environment variables in a Linux system, and the Mac based procedure should also be similar. So for today's video, I have a EC2 instance that is running that we are going to use for today's demo. This is a new EC2 instance that I have launched from Amazon Linux based operating system. So at this stage, for this specific EC2 instance, I do not have Terraform that is available. So I'll go ahead and I'll quickly install Terraform. So I'll select the Linux, and within here also there are multiple operating system. We are going to use Amazon Linux. Let's go ahead and quickly install Terraform here. I'll copy all of the commands and the last one, which is yum install Terraform. Great. So once the Terraform is installed, if you try to run Terraform, you see we are getting the basic help page. Now, as we're discussing, the aim of today's video is related to the environment variables. Now, generally, whenever you type a command call as print env, so print env will go ahead and it will show you all of the environment variables that are currently set. Now, note this is not for Windows. So generally in Windows, you have a slightly different command. Now, when you do a print env, you see you have so many environment variables that are currently set over here. Now, let's do one thing. The code that we had earlier used for variable assignment, I'll just copy this code and I'll just create a file called as demo.tf, and I'll be adding the code here. And similarly, I'll just define a variable here with the name of instance underscore type, and this variable is not defined. All right, I'll save the change. Now, if you quickly do a Terraform init, since this is a new initialization, I'll clear the screen. Now, if you do a Terraform plan, at this stage, as expected, it is asking us to provide the instance type. So I'll do a Control C. As we're discussing, the value can also be added as part of the variable. So adding variable in Linux is very simple. Same should work for Mac as well. You run the export command. You specify the name of variable. Let's say instance underscore type, and you specify the value. Let's say T2 large. Once you have created a variable, you can run the echo command followed by the name of the variable to see the value. And here the value is T2.large. So it looks fine at an overview. Now, if you do a Terraform plan, again, you see it is asking for instance underscore type. So did you realize why it is still asking? If you look into the slide, whenever you are using the environment variable, the naming convention needs to be followed. Now we had not followed the naming convention and hence the issue came. So let's again set it. I'll say tf underscore var underscore instance underscore type. This time I'll say m5.large. Using the echo command, you can verify the value associated with the environment variable. It is m5.large. So now if you run the Terraform plan, this time it will not ask you for the prompt for variable. You see that prompt is not coming. So again you are getting an error. Why you are getting an error? Because at this stage we have not added the credentials. So the provider block, the access secret key are not added as part of the code. Hence the error. But this time the prompt that it was asking earlier is no longer present. And this is the main aim of today's video. So generally after you have added the access secret key, this error should go away. Now let me do one thing just for simplicity, just to ensure that there is no confusion at all. Let me also just add it here. So let's do one thing. Let's quickly open up our demo.tf file. And within here, I'll just specify the access and secret keys. I'll save this. Always verify with the cat command what is the final output. You have the providers block. You have the variable that is defined in the same file. Ideally for production environment, remember the variable should not be in the same file. It should be in a file called as variables.tf. However, it does not really matter from working perspective. Even if the variable is in the same file, from Terraform perspective, this will also work. So now if you do a Terraform plan, this time you see it is working and the value that it has taken is m5.large. Alright, so I hope with this you understood on how you can set the environment variable for other operating systems apart from Windows as well. So with this we'll conclude today's video. Hi everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video, we are going to discuss about the variable definition precedence. Now understanding of this topic is important specifically if you want to save a lot of troubleshooting time in the future, and also from the exam perspective, this is an important topic to know. Now, if you have explored our video associated with approach to variable assignment, we have learned that in Terraform, the value for a variable can be set at multiple different places. Now, when a value can be added at multiple places, the question that comes is, what if the value for variables are different in different places? Alright, this is a very important part to understand. For example, let's say that in the environment variable, the value associated with one of the variable is 1. But in the tfvars file, the value associated with the same variable is 2. So now you have a complete opposite values added in different place. So now the question that comes is, what value will Terraform take? Will Terraform take the value as 1 for a specific undefined variable, or will it take the value of 2? So this is what we are going to study in today's video. So let's understand this challenge with a simple example where you have defined a variable called as instance underscore type and there is no value associated with it. Now at this stage we already know that we have to provide a value for this variable. It can be in any place. It can be through command prompt, it can be through environment variable and so on. The value must be specified here. Now in such case, let's assume that you have decided to add a default value. So inside this variable you have added a default value as t2.micro. Apart from that, you have also decided to add the value associated with the instance type variable in a file of terraform.tfvars and the value this time is t2.small. Apart from that, you have also decided to add the value associated with the instance type variable as t2.large as part of your environment variable. Now the question that comes is, which value will Terraform take? And this is very important for us to understand. Now in this case, your understanding about the variable definition precedence is very important, and it states that Terraform loads the variable in the following order with the later sources taking precedence over the earlier one. Very important part to understand. We are also going to explore this practically in just a moment. So what this states, first Terraform will take the value from environment variable. Whatever value is there, it will take it. Then it will take it from the terraform.tfvars file if it is present. Then it will take from terraform.tfvars.json file if it is present. Then any auto.tfvars or auto.tfvars JSON file, if they are present, it will take from there. And then any -var or -var file options on the command line, if you have specified, it will take from here. So what does this mean? Let's say that the value associated with a variable for environment variable is 1. You have defined the value in terraform.tfvars as 2, terraform.tfvars.json as 3, and in the var option, you have specified it as 5. So in such case, Terraform will take the value as 5. So this is what it states, the later sources taking the precedence over the earlier one. So if the value is specified in tfvars and you specify the value using the var option, then var option will take the highest precedence here. So let's understand this with an example where you have an environment variable of instance type as t2 micro and you have the terraform.tfvars as t2 large. So based on our learning of the variable precedence, what is the value that Terraform is going to take? It is going to take the t2 large, because the tfvars file has the higher precedence than the environment variable. So let's take one more example. This time the value of instance type in environment variable is t2 micro, value in tfvars file is t2 large, and the value that you define in the Terraform plan operation with the -var option is m5.large. So now which value will Terraform take? It is going to take the m5.large. So the variable precedence slide that we were discussing is very important. Make sure that you learn it from exam perspective as well. Now let's understand this from practical point of view. Now for today's practical, I have a simple file called as variable-precedence.tf, a very simple file. All it does is it creates a EC2 instance. So now based on our learning associated with the PPT, we are going to explore each step. So let's do one thing. The instance type here, let's just make it as a variable. I'll say var.instance_type and I'll save it. Now I'll create a file called as variables.tf. Within here, I'll say variable of instance underscore type, and I'll specify the default value here as t2.micro. This is one part. Now from the terminal, when we do a Terraform plan, let's look into what the output shows. At this stage, if we go a bit up, you see the instance type is t2.micro. Now here one thing to note is that the environment variable is not set. In case if you have in the earlier video you have set the environment variable, it will take the value of environment variable here. For an example, as we were discussing, as part of the variable definition precedence, the first thing that Terraform will check is the environment variable. So for example, this default value will be overridden if you have one more value as part of the environment variable. Let's also explore that. Let me just quickly set the environment variable here. Now again, we already have learned on how we can set environment variable for different operating system. I am using it for Windows. I'll say tf var instance underscore type. I'll say t2.small. I'll save it. Alright. So now you have the default value as t2 micro and the environment variable value of t2 small. So I'll close the command prompt so that environment variable can load. And let's open up the new prompt yet again. So now if you do a Terraform plan, this time you see t2 small has taken the higher precedence. So this is one part. Second one is terraform.tfvars file. So let's also create terraform.tfvars file, and for the instance type, let's say t2.large. I'll save this. Let's clear the screen. I'll do a Terraform plan yet again. This time you see Terraform has taken the tfvars file value, which is t2 large. So I hope with this you have started to understand what variable definition precedence allows us to do. The next thing that we are going to explore is the var option here. So I'll clear the screen. I'll say Terraform plan -var instance type is equal to, let's say m5.large. Let's press enter. And this time you see m5.large has taken the higher precedence. Great. So I hope with this you understood the basics of variable definition precedence. Now sometimes what happens is that in production environments, if you are running Terraform in Jenkins or something, the value that you set in terraform.tfvars file is not taking into effect whenever you are running the apply operation. So in such cases, you have to also look into other options to verify if other value is taking higher precedence than the one that you had set. So this is one important part that you have to keep a note of, and with this we will conclude today's video. Hi everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video again we are going to discuss about yet another important topic in Terraform, which is data types. Understanding about data type is very crucial in order to effectively write the Terraform code. Now one more advantage about this topic is that if you're learning any other programming language, say Java or maybe scripting like Python, even in those areas data type is one of the common topics that you will see. So if you understand data types properly, not only it will help you in Terraform, but it will help you in wide range of technologies, primarily because the concept remains to be the same. So with this base set, let's go ahead and understand it at an overview. Now at a high level overview, data type refers to the type of value that you add as part of your configuration file. Now for example, let's say that you are trying to create a EC2 instance. So in EC2 instance, you add wide variety of values like the instance type or AMI ID and so on. So those values that you add associated with a specific argument are associated with a specific data type that Terraform supports. Now depending upon the resource that you use and depending upon the argument that you use, the data type that is supported will also differ here. Now what we are going to do, we are going to take a simple table that allows us to understand two very specific data types in Terraform, which are quite easy to understand to begin with. Alright, so here you see there are two examples. One is hello world and second is 7575. So the hello world that you see, the data type associated with it is a string, and 7575, the data type that is associated with it is a number. Now from here we can easily understand that 7575 is a number. So this number is a data type. Again, hello world is a string. So even if you replace this with any other word, for example, Earth or KP Labs, all of those belongs to the string data type. So this string data type, it generally refers to some kind of a text that you add. Now, one of the great benefits in Terraform is that you can restrict the variable value to a specific data type. And this specific example will also allow us to understand the basics of data type in a much more better way. For example, let's say that there is a requirement where only numbers should be allowed in AWS usernames. So you are trying to create multiple set of users in AWS and you do not really want the username to be string. You only want numbers. So numbers would be associated with a unique number that each employee has. Something like an employee ID or something is what needs to be allowed. So this kind of a use case can also be achieved. Now, before we look into what exactly this is all about, let's take a simple demo to understand the requirement. Now, generally in AWS or any other provider that you choose, whenever you're trying to add a user, you see, this is the username like demo user, KP Labs video user, Terraform, and so on. So all of this is something that you can refer to as a string. Now, what the requirement states is that whenever a user that gets created through Terraform in AWS, the string should not be used. Instead of this, only numbers should be allowed. So for today's demo, we have a file called as data-types.tf, a very simple configuration here. What it does, it creates a user in AWS with a specific name. In this case, the name is load balancer. Now, before we look into things in a practical way, let me quickly show you a demo so that there is no confusion that arises. Now, I have already done the Terraform init from my side just to save time. So what we'll do, we'll quickly do a Terraform apply and we'll see what exactly this resource does. As we were discussing, all it does is it creates a specific user. Now, if I refresh this, you see we have a new user in AWS called as load balancer. Now, similar to what we were discussing, the company has a requirement where whatever username that is added over here. So this specific username you can refer to as a string. So instead of string, what you want only numbers to be allowed. So numbers would be in turn associated with the employee ID of a specific user. So when you have such kind of a requirement, you can restrict the variable to a specific data type. For example, you have a variable of username and then you explicitly say what is the type of value that this variable should support. In this case, the type is number. So then you can only associate number associated with this variable. Let's explore this as well. So let's modify this code a bit. I'll say variable of username. All right. And you can reference this part to the variable. Now, before we do that, since we had created the user, let me just remove it so that we can start from scratch. Now at this stage, since we have defined a variable without a value, it is just asking us to specify the value. I'll just add any random string here. Great. So our user is deleted. So now instead of specifying the value here, you can reference it to the variable. I'll say var dot user name. All right. So whatever value this variable has will be computed here. I'll save this. I'll clear the screen. Now when we do a Terraform plan, as we were discussing, there is no explicit value that we have defined associated with the variable of username in the configuration. And this is the reason why it is asking us the value in the CLI. So let's say I'll add a value as zeal. So at this stage, there are no restriction about the value that you can add over here. And this is the reason why you see Terraform is trying to create a user called as zeal in AWS. Now, as we are discussing in the PPT as well, if you want, you can also restrict the value here. Let's say I'll restrict the value to number. All right, I'll save this. Let's clear the screen. Let's do a Terraform plan yet again. Again, it is asking for username. Let's try zeal. And you see, immediately it failed. Why did it fail? It says invalid value for an input variable. and it is also showing a number is required. So this specific value is referred to as a string. So string here is not supported, a number is required. Alright, so I hope with this at a very high level overview you understood the two data type, which is string and a number. Along with that, we also looked into how we can restrict the value associated with a variable to a specific data type. Now again, one thing that needs to be noted is that in Terraform there are many data types that are available that solves different kind of use cases. So in the next slide, I have also added details related to the wide variety of data types that are supported in Terraform. We have discussed string, which is a sequence of Unicode characters representing some text like hello. The second data type that we explored is a number, which is a numeric value. Apart from that, there are various other data types like boolean, list, set, map, null and so on that are available. Again, all of these data types, depending upon the use case, these proves to be very important. At this stage, our aim here is to understand data type at a very high level overview. As and when required, we'll have a separate dedicated video associated with each data type that Terraform supports. Now before we conclude, one thing that needs to be noted is that whenever you're writing the Terraform configuration, associated with a specific argument, a value is required. Now the value that you can add can be associated with a specific data type. It is not necessary that you can only add string. It is not necessary that you can only add numbers. Some argument requires that you add a data type of list. Some argument requires that you add a data type of map and so on. So all of those details you will find in the documentation. Let me also show you that. So for today's video, we are going to look into the documentation page associated with the resource of AWS_instance. Now, if you look into the overall example usage that they have added over here, you see some things initially it looks quite confusing. For example, here in the AWS_instance, the instance underscore type is T3 micro. So this is a simple string. Now you have tags. In the tags, you have some curly braces. Inside curly braces, you have name is equal to hello world. So similar to that, you see there is one more example where you have owners. Then within here, you have square brackets in which the specific value is added. So how does one know whether you have to add a curly braces here or a square brackets here and so on? Because if you try to add a square brackets here and a curly braces here, it will not work. So this is where the documentation proves to be very important. For example, let's go a bit down. Associated with the argument references, here they specify what data type is required, specifically when string is not directly supported. So let's take an example. So here you see we are taking an example of tags. Now within here you see they have explicitly specified that the data type that needs to be added is of map. Very similar to that, even for the security group, or if you look into the VPC security group, let's explore that. You see VPC security group here, it says list of security group IDs. Now if you look into the data type in Terraform, there is a specific data type of list. There is a specific data type of map. So whenever you're trying to add a tag, you have to use the data type of map. Whenever you're trying to specify the security group IDs, in such case you have to specify list and so on. Now before we conclude, let me also quickly show you this in order to avoid any confusion associated with this video. So let's do one thing. Let's go ahead and copy the basic example reference here. I'll add it. Now in the AMI, let's do one thing. Let's quickly go to the EC2 service here. I'll launch an instance so that we can get an AMI ID here. I'll copy this and let me just add it over here. Alright, tags will remove just for simplicity. Now within here, let's try and specify the VPC security group ID. So from the documentation, let's quickly search for VPC security group IDs here. I'll copy this. And just for simplicity, what I'll do, there should be a security group, default security group that should be available. Alright, so I'll copy the security group ID here and let me add the value. I'll save it, This part you can temporarily remove it. I'll save the change. I'll clear the screen. Let's go ahead and do a Terraform plan. Immediately here you see we got an error stating incorrect attribute value type here. So there is something wrong with the type of value that you have added to the VPC security group ID. Now in such cases, if you have not studied the data type videos that we have in this course, this specific error will be a little confusing. If you have studied it, things will become much more simpler. Now in the VPC security group ID, let's go down. You see what it states? It states list of security group IDs to associate with. Now if you look into our data type chart over here, associated with the data type of list, what it says? A sequence of values like the one example that is been specified. So these are the square brackets. So now if you try to add this value in square brackets, let's save this. Let's do a Terraform plan. This time you see it is working. Alright, so depending upon the specific argument in the resource block, the data type requirements will also change. So you always have to see the documentation to understand the exact data type that is required, and based on that, the way you add a value associated with the argument will also change. So that's a very high level overview about the data type, and with this we'll conclude today's video. Hi everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we are going to discuss about the data type of list. Again, this is a very important data type, and in a lot of arguments for resources, list is one of the common data type that is required. So with this said, let's go ahead and understand more about it. Now at a very high level overview, list data type allows us to store collection of values for a single variable or an argument. So this collection of values is very important. Now let us also quickly understand this specific pointer. For example, for a resource of AWS_instance where a simple EC2 instance gets created. So here you have an instance type which is t3.micro. So here you have a single value associated with the argument of instance_type. Only single value is present. But for many of the arguments, single value is not expected. Multiple set of values can also be expected. In such cases, the list data type is also used, which allows you to store collection of values where multiple set of values can be expected for a specific variable or an argument. Now the list data type is represented by a pair of square brackets, something similar to, you see, you have a square bracket here, a square bracket here, and inside the square bracket you have multiple set of values in a comma separated sequence. So you have the first value A, then you have a comma, second value, comma, third value, and so on. And as we were discussing, the list data type is useful when multiple values needs to be added for a specific argument. So if you take a simple example, this is a variable, the type is list, and if you see the default value here in the square brackets, you have Mumbai, Bangalore and Delhi. So this is what list allows us to do. Now again, whenever you are creating resources through Terraform, documentation is quite extensive regarding what data type it expects. For example, here you see there is an argument of volume_tags. It expects the data type of map. If you explore second argument, VPC security group IDs, here it is expecting the data type of list and so on. Now for today's practical, I have a file called as list-data-type.tf, a very simple configuration file. What it does, there is a variable that is specified and you have an output. So whatever value this variable has, that value will be presented to us as an output in CLI. So let's quickly explore that. So in my CLI, let's go ahead and quickly do a Terraform plan. So here it is asking us for a value. So let's say I'll add a value called as hello-world, and within here you see the variable underscore value is hello-world. Now in fact, just to avoid any confusion, let me do a Terraform apply with auto approve. It will ask us with a value. I'll say value is hello world, and after the apply is completed, in the outputs here, it will simply display whatever value the variable of my list has. Alright, so now let's do one thing. Let's take a step further and let's specify the value requirement associated with this variable. So I'll say type is equal to list. So now we have explicitly specified that this variable value must be of type list. I'll save this. Let's clear the screen. Let's do a Terraform apply with auto approve again. So this time let's specify hello. Immediately here you see we got an error. Now this error, if you read it, it is not very useful. It states no value for a required variable. This is not a very easy to understand error. So this is the reason why your understanding about data types are important. So as we know that list is expected and the way in which we specify list is square brackets and you specify some value here. Let's say test, let's say hello. This time you see it worked. After apply completed, in the variable value we got test and we got hello. Alright, so I hope with this at a very high level overview you understood what list allows us to do. Now let us also understand some of the practical scenarios so that we understand the data type properly. So let's say that you are trying to create a EC2 instance. So let's do one thing. In fact, let me just copy the code here. We'll make it very simple. Alright. We'll also remove the previous code to keep things simple. Now, within here, the AMI, you can just specify any random AMI. I'll just say AMI 1, 2, 3. We are not creating the resources as of now. We are just understanding the concept. Now, as we are discussing that there are certain argument that requires a data type of list. So if you explore the overall documentation, one of the argument that we know is VPC security group ID. So here you see it states list of security group IDs to associate with. So let's in fact add that. I'll say VPC security group IDs and within here you can specify the security group IDs here. Now one of the question that generally comes is, in fact let me also quickly show you this. So it can happen that there can be multiple set of security groups. In fact let me quickly show you. So at this stage, I only have one security group. Let me just create one more security group. Alright, I'll just create one more security group randomly. Now at this stage, we have two security group associated with a region. Now let's assume that whatever EC2 instance that we want to create, it should not have only one security group, but it should have two security group. Now generally whenever you try to create it through the console, you can easily select multiple set of security groups. So here you see you have the default and you have the test. So from the GUI you can select multiple set of security groups here. And similar to what we have discussed, whenever there is collection of values, list is one of the important data type that is used. And this is the reason why whenever you are using the VPC security group ID, they expect you to provide the details as part of the list where multiple values can be added. For example, one might say that you can do something similar to this. Let me show you. So in fact, let's go back. And in the security group, you have security group ID associated with each security group. Let me copy the ID. So this is the ID. So initially you might say that we can also define it in a way like this. I'll add a comma. The second security group ID, let's copy this. I'll add a comma. So this is also one of the ways in which you can specify two set of security group IDs. Alright. So when you try to do that, it will not work. However, let's also verify that. So I'll do a Terraform plan. Immediately here you see we got an error. And this is the reason why it is always important to verify the data type that is supported for an argument. So whenever you have to specify multiple set of values here, list is one of the important data type. So now you can add it as part of the list. Alright, it will look something similar to this. I'll save it. I'll do a Terraform plan. And you see it is working. So in the VPC security group ID you see you have two security group that is added. Alright. So I hope with this at a high level overview you understood the list data type. Now, one more important thing that I wanted to share is that it can also happen that the list data type only has a single value at a particular stage. That will also work. For example, let's assume that there is only a single value associated with a security group ID argument here. So this will also work in a list. So if you do a Terraform plan, you see single value also works. So it is not that if you only have a single value, you can remove the list and you can use a simple string data type. This will not really work. If you try this, it will immediately give an error. I'll do a Terraform plan. You see, it is giving an error. So even if you have a single value, but if an argument requires a list, then you must provide a list. Alright, this is very important part that needs to be remembered. Now, before we conclude this video, one more important area that you need to keep a note of is that in a data type, you can also specify the type of value that you can add. For example, in a list, as we know, you can add multiple set of strings. So it is a collection of values. Now, what type of value you can add in a list is also something that you can define. For example, you have a variable called as mylist, type is list, and here you have a number. So this list will only accept collection of values that are number. Very important part to remember. Let's also try it out. Let's say I'll add a variable of my-list, and within here I'll say type is list. This is very easy to understand. Now in fact, let me also remove this resource block. I'll save the change. Let's clear the screen. Now when you do a Terraform plan, it will ask you to enter the value. So I'll say hello. Alright. Now if I press enter, you did not really get an error. That is completely fine. Now let me also show you, if you do not add a list, it will immediately give an error. Alright. Now, as we are discussing, you can also specify what kind of value this list must have. In this case, we have specified number. So only numbers will be allowed to be added as part of the list. I'll save the change. Let's clear the screen. Let's do a Terraform plan. Now this time, let's try hello. And again, as expected, we got an error. Let's do a Terraform plan yet again. This time, let's add value, say 1. Let's say 2. And this time, you see, we did not really get an error here. So depending upon the exact use case, there is a lot of flexibility related to what type of value a specific data type can also have. However, at this stage, we are keeping it simple. I hope you understood the basics of the list data type in Terraform. And with this, we'll conclude today's video.